I spent a week on death's bed. I almost did not make it, but I then learned to manage goals and manage the pace in a way that was productive for longevity.
Sébastien Page is CIO and head of global multi-asset at Rowe Price,
overseeing more than $500 billion in assets.
He's an award-winning finance researcher, best-selling author,
and one of the leading voices connecting investment strategy with the psychology of leadership.
Goal-induced blindness occurs when you're so focused on your goal, usually a measurable goal, that you lose sight of everything else that matters in your life.
You talk about the agreeableness paradox. The skills that gets you in the promoted is often the first one that you lose once you are in the seat. What do you think is driving people to shift when they're at the top?
As a leader, if you're too agreeable, you're going to be...
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leader Show. Today, we have with us Sébastien Page. He's the CIO at Rowe Price, managing $500 billion plus in assets. And he's also the author of The Psychology of Leadership. So welcome to the show, Sébastien.
Andrea, I am super fired up. I've been looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Great, me too. But I would like to start with something that really struck with me. You know, when you were telling me about your story, and everybody has this story, and everybody has some sort of setback or specific crisis that we faced in the past. And I like to go there, but because there is a reason. Because the work that you're doing, the book that you have written, they have that in the background. Because that really, as far as I understand, has really shaped, your own leadership journey. And what I would like to start with is, you're managing incredible amount of money in assets. You lead teams in PhDs in one of, I would say, in the most high pressure environments, right? But at some point in early days, you really struggled with something very personal, something that you dealt with that really shaped, the entire experience. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what happened?
Thanks for asking. I think it's a great place to start. I was a young up-and-comer, ambitious, working hard in the world of money management. Andrea, I was traveling the world, and I was not really taking care of myself. I was not sleeping enough. That was the biggest problem. One day, I'm in Canada visiting family with my wife, and I start to shake. I can't understand why I'm shaking because I don't even have a fever. It's the strangest thing ever. I decide to drive back to Boston, hoping it would go away. At some point, the fever starts. I arrive in Boston, and my wife decides, we got to get you to the hospital.
Right.
I spent a week on death's bed. I almost did not make it. I had an infection, a mysterious infection that they never truly diagnosed. At the end of the week, the doctor said, Sébastien, we had new antibiotics here. If we hadn't had those, maybe 3 years ago, you wouldn't have made it. I look back at what happened when I got sick. I was exhausted and jet lagged. I decided to go out to run outside. I didn't know, but I had cuts on my toes. It was wet terrain. There's a mysterious bacteria that got in my bloodstream. I didn't end up with, it was kind of like the flesh-eating bacteria, but I didn't end up with any permanent damage from it. But it got into my abdomen, and it was excruciating pain and fever, and that explained the shaking. For the entire week, the doctors were trying to isolate it. And what they do is they carpet bomb your bloodstream with every and all antibiotics they can have. That's their only chance they have. I mean, they talked about surgery. It was a whole ordeal. But the takeaway for me stepping back after this was something's not working. We talk a lot in leadership about resilience. And resilience comes from the basics, the meat and potatoes. Andrea, everybody's got a podcast talking about cold plunges and supplements and all that stuff. What I realized that day was that I was running a marathon. A career is a marathon. It's a long distance, long time event. And I was not building in enough rest. The sleep, the lack of sleep, and the tiredness made me vulnerable to infections. And now, fast forward to present day, when I'm asked to go give advice at Harvard, MIT, or Wharton, I talk to the top students in the world. I gave a talk at Wharton last week. They want me to give them advice about career. And I look at the students. You're all super smart. Employers are all looking to hire you. You don't need my advice, but let me tell you something. Sleep well, eat an okay diet, and exercise. Wash, rinse, repeat. Do this throughout your career. Everything else will take care of itself. You'll build more resilience. Running for me is a complete stress buster. It decreases my stress right away. I'll give you an unscientific estimate. By about 50% is how I feel pre and post run. So this was years ago, right? But I then learned to manage goals and manage the pace in a way that was productive for longevity.
Wow, what a story. And unfortunately, Sebastian, that's not the first one I hear actually on the show. And people, by the way, that applies to everybody, what you just said, right? But clearly, at least in my experience, especially that I'm surrounded by a lot of people in a very critical position as leaders, primarily CEOs, but not only them. I can tell you how the level of pressure and stress has incredibly increased in the last few years due to a number of conditions and situations. We don't need to explain it right now, but that's what you just described that happened to you is, by the way, unfortunately, common patterns, for many leaders now dealing with already demanding work and job, but also demanding conditions where to operate. So I totally get it, So to me, by the way, I'm glad that you're here. First of all,
thank you.
That is the most important thing. But the lessons is there. I mean, I had here on a show. I had a CEO, an American CEO. They said that what was going through in dealing with all that pressure and stress that he faced as a CEO. Not only that, unfortunately, a very, very serious impact on his health, but also on his family, in a way how people, deal with their personal lives. So anyway, I'm glad that you shared this because to me, it's such a great reminder that everybody should really, just really take away from this. Even if we stop the podcast here, I think to me, it could be even enough for people, right, to deal with this reality. Now, if we move a little bit in more positive, context where things then you move on, of course. But even before that, you have studied psychology. So why? So what were you looking for that maybe the finance world couldn't give you? I mean, you are a leader in finance, but you have so much interest in psychology. So what's your take? Why? Walk us through a little bit about that choice.
That's more recent. To be clear, I'm a research nerd as a general statement. Most of my career, I published scientific articles in mathematical finance and economics. I love research. I love the cutting edge, reading the papers, understanding them. But the interest in psychology starts about 5 years ago when, despite my origin story of realizing that to have a long-term successful career, you need to take care of yourself, I was stressed at work. And not only was I stressed, but I was stressing about stressing. I kept telling myself, you've been in this business for 20 years. You should not be stressed. So I had the background voice beating myself up about my stress. As you can imagine, that's not productive. Yeah. I ended up talking to a sports psychologist, and that was the spark. He told me a story that sent me down a research nerd rabbit hole of sports and positive psychology. So we sit down, and his name is Dr. Daniel Zimmett. He lives around where I live in Maryland. He's really interesting because he's a PhD psychologist who trains National Football League players, pro baseball players, Olympic athletes, but he himself is also a pro athlete. He has 40 national titles in the sport of handball. Handball is kind of like squash, but you whack the ball with your hands.
Yes.
40 titles. You need to have your mental game figured out to win 40 titles. We sit down and he decides that he's going to tell me the story of the best match of handball that he ever played. Andrea, it's so fascinating because he remembers everything about that match, even though it took place 10 years prior. He remembers where the ball was at point 3. It hit the wall that way, that way. He's got a vivid image. And as he's telling the story, he's reliving the match. There's a point where he goes, I'm on my knees and I make an extreme shot that I never thought I could make. And I'm on the edge of my seat listening to this story. But then it's a complete letdown because he goes, I lost the next 2 points. And in a nonchalant way reveals that he lost the match. This was his introduction to me of the difference in sports psychology between mastery and ego. Winning or losing the match at that point in his career related to his ego. The reason why he was so excited about this match, and it's a watershed moment for him, is that he was playing one of the top players and he played to the best of his ability. He played better than he had ever played before. In the sports psychology mindset, that's a complete win. That's a mastery win. From then on, he knew he was a better player. That's how I got interested in mastery versus ego, because if you think about business, and Andrea, you advise CEOs, right? There's a ton of ego in all of us in the C-suite.
Tell me about it. Yes.
But those that have a mastery orientation, can I get better for the sake of getting better? The classical example is the golf player who's super concerned with their handicap so they can brag to their friends. That's ego.
Right.
Now, imagine another golf player that gets home and she talks to her husband and she goes, hey, I'm super excited. I improved my swing today. That's a mastery orientation. So when you talk to CEO, I'm sure you're talking to them about improving their swing, running meetings better, learning to incorporate feedback better, learning to do things better in our world, in money management, research, getting better at research. And so that's where I started. And then I explored positive psychology, ultimately personality psychology, and then published a book, The Psychology of Leadership. I make it sound easy, but it was about 3 years of research.
Speaking of which, so thank you for sharing. And by the way, we have that passion in common, clearly, psychology, based on the work I do. I mean, most of my work is about mindset. So what we're talking about it is top of mind for me and the work I do. And speaking of your book, Sébastien, one thing that really struck me, I would say, is a quite, I don't know whether it's a contrarian idea, but I find quite relevant for the audience of this podcast. You know, people, they are at the top of their game. You talk about the agreeableness paradox. I mean, the skills that gets you in the promoted is often the first one that you lose once you are in the seat, if I'm not mistaken, from what you write in the book. Can you walk me a little bit through about that? Because that's, to me, is a very interesting idea as a paradox, which I'm sure many people, they will probably recognize in the way how they're operating.
The data shows that agreeableness is actually can impede your ability to get a promotion. But once you're in a high-level leadership position, is associated with higher performance. It's complicated because as you climb the ladder, less and less people will call you out.
Yes.
And it's very easy to become disagreeable and you think you control everything, so you become less of a listener. And that's a big problem. And people like you, Andrea, that advise executives, oftentimes the majority of the engagement is making the executive more self-aware about how others perceive their leadership. And oftentimes it's a complete lack of agreeableness. There's another side to this, though. As a leader, if you're too agreeable, you're going to be ineffective. You cannot go around trying to build consensus all the time because people will disagree and you will have to make difficult calls. And it's going to be absolutely exhausting if all you try to do is get 100% consensus on everything. It doesn't work. So in the psychology of leadership, there's a lot of research, but this part is my rule, my practical rule. I say, Be disagreeable 10% of the time. Sometimes you need to put your foot down and be disagreeable. It's a question of dosage and balance and picking your battles. You're going to have to make tough calls with winners and losers in your organization, and that's going to involve being disagreeable. It's difficult, but it's important to pick your battle. And just one more thing, Andrea, something I talk about in the book because I like to tell stories. There's an example of a leader in popular culture who is too disagreeable, right? So you don't want to be too agreeable or too disagreeable. You need to be conscious, aware of picking your battles. But the prototypical leader who's too disagreeable is from the show Game of Thrones. Now, I don't know how many people in your audience have watched the show Game of Thrones, but there's a character there, King Joffrey. He's a young king, and he's the most disagreeable. He's the most evil, most hated TV character maybe of all time. King Joffrey is just cruel. He's a tyrant, and he just disagrees with everybody. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with being disagreeable, for example, in an academic context. It's a matter of how. But let's just say that King Joffrey is a caricature of an extremely disagreeable person. And they're sitting there with the family, trying to make some tough decisions in Game of Thrones. The intrigue is very high. And young King Joffrey gets upset at his brother and pounds the table and goes, "I am the king, and I will punish you." And the wise grandfather, Tywin, is sitting there, sits back a little bit, and says the following: "Any man who needs to say, 'I am the king,' is no true king."
Yes.
And the idea is that if you find yourself having to assert your authority all the time, there's something probably wrong with your leadership. You're probably not inspiring the team enough. You're probably not confident enough in your decisions. It's a symptom of a leadership problem. So there you go. I'm not sure are people listening to this were expecting some Game of Thrones analogies, but here we are.
It's perfect. Actually, it's a perfect analogy. I think that works so well in the context of what you described. I'd like to go back a second on what you said before, and then I'll come back to the last part that you said, the king, the role of the king. One, I think, is, Patrick Lencioni, I'm a big fan of it. I'm sure that you have read, his stuff, which is great. He talks quite well of finding that level of balance between creating what he called the artificial harmony, and to, on the other end of the spectrum, just toxic conflict, when essentially this sort of engaging with people, being agreeable, but to some extent is needed. Now, I think what you are describing as fully agreeable as an individual, as a leader, to me, it moves you straight to the end of the spectrum in terms of the artificial harmony. So you're just trying to create a harmony for the sake of harmony, but that doesn't really drive what is needed in the organization. So I'm with you, finding the right balance, but be more on that. You call it conflict. Other people, they don't like the word, but it's really conflict, positive, constructive conflict that needs to be generated to, spark people's idea, get that fire. So, and people need that, as well as people need to have a leader that stands for what is important to them. And to me, it's a good segue for the next conversation, because one thing I see very often, Sébastien, I would love to get your view on that, especially at the CEO level, is what I call the identity gap. Meaning CEOs, they're new into their new role, maybe they're being promoted. And what they're trying to do, maybe they've been great collaborative leaders before as functional leaders. They were so good in working with others, and maybe they're becoming CEO, and either they use the same identity that worked in the past without appreciating that the new role requires something completely different because it's a new context, or on the other way, again, a spectrum, they start to behave in a very completely different way, most of the time driven by what you describe, ego, status, you name it. What has been your experience? You think getting to the top is unfortunately driving people to either don't appreciate it, that their identity doesn't work, or or maybe it's an opportunity for them to get to the surface what is really is their set values. Because to me, that is one of the most important thing. And I mean, there is a lot of research that's been done in terms of what drives specific behaviors when you sit at the top. And again, the other people, The Art of Impossible, a great book from Steve Kotler, talks a lot about how the testosterone, for example, very few people know, has an impact in terms of how people show up at the top, because that gets, built up inside of your system. Anyway, long question to ask. What do you think is driving people to shift when they're at the top, from your experience?
The lack of clear feedback, because it becomes difficult for others to tell you about how they perceive you and to give you genuine feedback. I think that's the number one factor where you see personality changes. And that's why the feedback process is so important. But generally, there's so many things that shift when you reach high level leadership in terms of the requirements to do a good job that a lot of us don't adapt really well. For example, to become a good leader, to climb the ladder, it really helps to be a strong communicator.
Yeah.
You know what? Once you reach a high level leadership job, it's no longer about that. It's about your listening skills. A lot of leaders will fail to make that transition. Here's another one. A lot of people imagine that to be a strong leader, you need to never give up, right? That sounds like really good advice, and be resilient. And the most prized high-level leadership skill for decision-making is not to stick to things that you've started, is to know when to strategically quit, is to be able to scale back on a project that you know is not going to work. That's what differentiates the strong leaders. It's actually easy to stick to something, especially when you invested a lot. But can you pivot? Can you be like Netflix, where they realized they were mailing DVDs and were successful, but that they had to switch to streaming and reorient the company? Do you have the ability to quit the DVD business, even though you have an infrastructure behind it? So quitting is actually a really, really, really strong skill and rare for top-level leadership. Again, a lot of leaders don't adapt to that change. And one more, Andrea. One more. Quick decision-making, decisiveness, that's going to get you there. But once you're there, the top leaders are able to know when they need to be strategically patient. When the entire world wants you to make a decision, but you decide to preserve the optimality and be strategically patient. I have a chapter in the Psychology of Leadership about strategic patience. So it almost flips on its head what top-level leadership becomes. It's not about you and talking, it's about listening. It's not about sticking to things, it's the quitting skill that's differentiated. And everybody can make quick decisions, and you have to make quick decisions, but can you be strategically patient when you need to? All these are adaptations that a lot of us have had a hard time with, myself included. We need to learn this.
It's great. And I cannot agree more. So I think it's such a great sharing. If we now circle back to the feedback, I'm very interested into that, because you're definitely right. The higher you get in the organization, the less is the opportunity to get, real feedback from people. And that affects your ability to build your own awareness, because you're only driven by your own self-awareness, which sometimes, you are on the spot. Most of the time you're not. I mean, it's something that I do as well, with clients at the beginning. I'm trying to get different perspective, because otherwise, you are a little bit biased in terms of what you see for yourself. We both love neuroscience. That's what we heard. That's what we learned, before getting into this episode. And I think we both love David Rock, who is one of the, talking about kings, one of the kings of neuroscience.
He's awesome.
He's awesome. And one part of your research, I think is in the book, which I found fascinating, I didn't know, by the way, is, I think what David Rock said, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that, ask for feedback produce a 50% lower stress response than unsolicited feedback.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting. And I get it because that's, to me, is also what the spirit is. A massive number, 50%. in terms of stress level, which is an indicator for performance and other things, of course. Now, in your opinion, based on that, how does that change the way how leaders should give feedback to each other? Or especially CEO giving feedback to the team, or the team giving a feedback to the CEO, for example.
Well, let's do an experiment with our audience right now. If you're listening to this, I'm going to ask a question, and I want everyone hearing the question to imagine that this is happening at work and to think about how you would react, how it feels to hear that question. So imagine we're coworkers and I come to you and I go, "Can I give you some feedback?" Most of us have a negative reaction to this. I can feel my fight or flight response. I think, uh-oh, something's going on.
Something wrong, yeah.
That's the stress response. By the way, there's also stress involved in giving feedback. Now, because I've studied sports psychology, I'm super interested in the fact that athletes absolutely love feedback. And they won't be happy with their coach if they don't get the feedback. The coach on the sideline,
right.
the tennis players hitting the balls, and the coach is saying, do it this way, you're missing this. And athletes are, give me more feedback. I want to get better. In the world of business, it's very different and it can be difficult. Can I give you some feedback? Oof, you don't want to hear that. So what Dr. David Rock showed, and he literally hooked people up to, monitors and scans and measured their sweat rate, their heart rate, he just realized his 50% number is amazing, that if you ask for the feedback, it's 50% less stressful than to receive it. But your question is key now. How do you foster that in the organization? You need to, in a subtle way or not so subtle way, encourage people to ask for feedback. How do you do that? First, you as the leader should go and ask for feedback regularly. And that takes confidence.
Yes.
But now you're modeling a behavior that others will do. Also, be very explicit that people should ask for feedback. When David Rock came to present to my company, right after his presentation, because I was involved in the people who invited him, he walked down to me and said, "Hey, what did you think? Like, can you give me some feedback on the presentation?" And you could tell it was very genuine. So you model it, you encourage it, and it makes the whole process better. We need the feedback to improve. Feedback is not perfect either, Andrea. I could go on and on about the pitfalls of feedback. Generally, it's a good way to improve, but there are some other sides to this. But I'll just stop here.
There are. And by the way, it's a great sharing. And I'll tell you my experience with feedback. And maybe I share a perspective that I think might be useful. I think was something that is missing. I learned in the last year in my own mastery journey, as you call it. What I learned is, Sebastian, is feedback, by the way, needs to be always in the context of what we are committed to as individuals. That's when the feedback make it different. Because if I know that the feedback I'm giving to you, because I know what you're committed to and what you're working on for yourself, my feedback will be better appreciated and you will be listening more with more interest, because that is important to you. I think the challenge comes when I give you feedback that is not necessarily related to what is committed to you, what is important to you. So then it might give you to a different direction, which is not for you at least the main priority. Now, it might look like a nuance, but it's an important distinction, because that requires, in my experience, that people should know better what they are committed to individually with each other, which is, by the way, is the basis, the foundation for strong connection. You're really connected to people when you know what is important to other people. And we know that is a principle of not only influence, that is a principle of all get related with people, which doesn't happen in the workplace, because normally you stay at a very superficial level. No, sometimes what you know is families, hobbies, all of that, but you don't really know what people are committed to. That's make a huge difference, because if you give me a feedback, if I'm an athlete and say, look, I'm committed as an athlete, and I'm a tennis fan, for example, to become the number 5 in the world, and I'm committed to change completely my serve to become, a hitter, somebody that can hit, 240 kilometers per hour, etc. Your feedback inside of that will make much more difference to me than a feedback about how I play my backhand. Not because it's not important, but it's not necessarily my priority in what I'm committed to. It's a stupid example, but
it's so important. There's a famous article titled The Feedback Fallacy. Marcus Buckingham is one of the authors. And they show, to your point, Andrea, that when you receive feedback, a lot of it, if not most of it, reflects the preferences and attitudes of the person giving the feedback. And that creates all sorts of biases.
it's a reflection. Sometimes we put our own reflection as a bias when I share feedback to you because I don't see in you what I see in myself, or I would like to see myself, but I don't see you. Then I give it feedback to you. So it's great. I mean, this conversation requires more time, but it's important. It's so important, especially at the top. And by the way, it's not just at the top. I think all the thing about feedback is still a big missing corporate. Regardless how many good AI tech tools that have been developed to really provide feedback, but lacking what we discussed is going to be always a very weak process in place. Great. I like to to move on something that also struck me in your book. I think it was in your last book, the Everest metaphor that you used, because you have a principle on the book that is don't die on Everest. So you write about climbers, if I'm not mistaken, who were so fixated on reaching the summit that they ignored every signal telling them to turn back. By the way, I think there was a similar story in the news, I think a couple of weeks ago, very similar to that, right? Is unfortunately a very common pattern. And you see the same pattern you said in boardrooms. So tell me about that, because I'm very curious.
If you want to reach the summit of Everest, you have a 4% chance of dying. To me, that's too high. It's not worth it. The skill that you need to achieve the summit multiple times, the world record holder has 30 summits, is quitting and knowing when to quit. Goal-induced blindness occurs when you're so focused on your goal, usually a measurable goal, that you lose sight of everything else that matters in your life. It could be, in my early example, my health, my sleep. It could be personal relationships outside of work. It could even be your sense of ethics. Some people are just so obsessed with the metrics that they start cheating. And this happens to world-class companies. Wells Fargo famously had people creating dummy bank accounts just to hit numbers. And they got caught doing that. Volkswagen cheated on their emission testing. I mean, these are blue chip, like world-class companies. So the goal-induced blindness, I think, is a risk, especially for high performers, when you become so obsessed with it. I like to say, Andrea, that Simone Biles became a better gymnast by watching Netflix on Sundays. And let me explain. In Tokyo in 2021, she famously walked out. She's the top gymnast. She walked out because she was overtrained, stressed, and there was anxiety, and she just could not perform. And she said very clearly that she was walking out for mental health reasons, and not everybody was on board with that. She was criticized for it. After that, she was tweeting, and for people who follow her, she was very open about taking time for herself, getting more sleep. She would tweet about, great Sunday, I went to church and watched Netflix. And then she came back in 23, won 4 gold medals, 1 silver, most decorated gymnast of all time. So Simone Biles became a better gymnast by watching Netflix on Sundays. If you have goal-induced blindness, if you're obsessed with the summit, you might sacrifice too much. And in fact, rest is part of delivering high performance. This comes naturally to top athletes, but that's part of goal-induced blindness. Do you see it, Andrea, when you talk to CEOs? Like, if you had to say what percentage of CEOs have some form of goal-induced blindness when you talk about them, in the sense that they're neglecting parts of their jobs or of their lives that aren't related to the quarterly numbers,
No, very often. What you describe is so much present to the lives of CEOs. There are a few good things that is worth saying on that. By the way, 100% right, what you just shared. One is related to the external forces nowadays, which I think is important that we say that. Meaning, we are living in a culture of expectations that haven't been so high as now. And the reason being, it probably is something that you see, Sebastian, not necessarily in your company, but in the system, in the environment that you spend time with, is whatever is happening in the world, whatever is happening in the context of where people are operating in lead at the moment, is creating an incredible level of expectations on leaders. Expectation to deliver faster, to deliver better, to reducing costs, you name it. And there is less time, especially there are a lot of research also in my book. We talk a lot about this. There is a less time available for CEOs to deliver the impact to whoever is the delivering to, right? The shareholders, board, and whatever. That creates an incredible level of stress that is not necessary, in my opinion. And also, it will lead, and it's discussed a lot about this, also with Gary Hamel here, the short-termism, right? So people that are now so focused on the short term because the long term is not enough for them because they don't have the bandwidth to think about long term. The expectation is short term. So I think that environment, Sebastian, is not helping people to avoid the blindness you're talking about. So we have to face it. The reality is what they're dealing with. It's not like somebody is necessarily waking up in the morning and say, today I want to smash my goal. I want to deliver something faster. There is way, way, way more expectation. That drives to pressure. And by the way, that is a great analogy of sport. Yes, pressure is privilege. And we heard that many times from sport coaches. It's a privilege, but you have to be ready and able to manage that pressure in a way that's positive, does not create, the vicious cycle that you explained, the stress and burnout.
And Andrea, if I can add, it's also present for early career people. I was speaking to a group of very talented finance students. They're going to have great careers. They're not going to be near the poverty line. They're going to make a lot of money. And I did a thought experiment where I had maybe about 1,000 people, and there was a giant ballroom. And I said, imagine I give you a jar of gummies. There's 100 gummies, 4 of them are poison, they're going to kill you. How much would I have to give you in order to eat one of those gummies? And by the way, this is the same statistic as Everest, 4% chance of dying. And I go, 200,000, raise your hand. At 1 million, I already had half the room. At 10 million, I had almost most of them. This is pure goal-induced blindness. You don't need this. The risk does not make sense. And positive psychology, this is trite, but shows that what really is going to make those students thrive is not going to be money. It's going to be relationships, the quality of their relationships, engagement in their work, meaning in their work, and long-term accomplishment. But it's everywhere.
No, it's thank you for sharing that, because that is so critical. And again, we're not really talking much about the young generation and how they are stepping into primarily the corporate world. What is the implication of that? Great. I think it's such a great point that you made. Last point I want to touch on this conversation is being amazing, Sebastian, is another framework that you introduced in your book, which is, I think, is called return on time spent. Is that right? So the idea that executives should treat their calendar like a CIO, like you, treats a portfolio, right? Now, in my experience, most CEOs, but not only CEOs, really, that really happens across the board. But let's say primarily with leaders at different level, they all treat the calendar the way they're controlled. I would say they are controlled by the calendar.
Yeah.
It's incredible what's going on, rather than controlling, rather than being intentional the way they want to spend their time. Now, what does your framework looks like in practice? In other words, how people should really reconsider the way they're spending their time based on that.
Very simple. Think about the various categories of how you spend your time, including emails, meetings, research, whatever you're involved with, commuting. Some things you can't change, some things you can definitely change. And be honest, pick up your phone and look at how many hours a day you scroll on social media. Put that in a spreadsheet or even do it as a mental exercise and ask yourself, given my long-term goals and what's going to make me thrive in the long term, quality relationships, meaning, engagement, accomplishment, what is the return on time spent for each of these categories? Next comes the part that is both easy and incredibly difficult. Learn to say no. Learn to say no to yourself when you want to scroll for 3 hours on social media. Learn to say no to others. I know it's difficult. I know sometimes it's your boss, it's a client. But everybody in your life, you all have an ability to say no that you're underestimating. Return on time spent, and then the most powerful word in time management, NO. Learn to say no to certain things. The problem is that the activities that have a very low return on time spent have a low activation threshold. You can easily pick up your phone and scroll social media.
Yes.
The activities that have a high return on time spent, like running, cardio, best way to reduce stress. It's hard to get yourself motivated and change your clothes and go out. It might be cold, it might be raining, but those are higher, much higher return on time spent. And by all means, take a holistic view of it. Positive relationships, number one factor of happiness in people's lives, according to the Harvard study that has been going on for 80 years. Return on time spent is very high if you spend the time with your family, for your mental health, for the quality of your life. So this is, I know we're going towards the end. I'm going to say, Andrea, that we didn't talk much about relationships. There's so much we could talk about because we both care about the same things. If you're listening to this, go find someone you love today. Tell them you love them. Give them a hug. See how you feel. Those things are important.
They're very important. And by the way, again, thanks for the reminder, because in the context that we just described, where people are so much busy, they have no time to think about anything, not even strategic in their work. How can they, squeeze? Well, that's unfortunately the word I use. Squeeze any other thing that looks like more personal, but is actually the more important thing they are missing at the moment. Family, spending time with kids, all of that.
And I mean, just to be more practical, because maybe I'm sounding theoretical here. If someone is inviting you to a meeting where it's going to be a status update and they're going to read a PowerPoint, can you politely say, I'm just going to read it, send it by email?
Yes.
And you might be surprised. Maybe people won't be that offended. And now it'll take you 15 minutes to read it. You'll save the extra 45 you would have taken sitting there.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just things like that. And everybody should relax. You should all watch movies, but just like maybe cut some that is too much, right? It's not hard. It sounds hard. Some of it is hard, but it's entirely doable.
It is. It is. So I have a last question, Sebastian. I always look at the end to reconnect with the beginning and reconnect with people's story. Now, I don't want to go back to to your very unfortunate, story that you presented at the beginning. But as far as I understand, your father was a finance professor,
Yeah,
and a cattle rancher.
yeah.
That's quite an unusual combination. We're not going there, okay? So that's not the purpose of this question. But what did you learn from watching him that shows up how you lead today? The reason I'm asking, because I lost my dad 3 months ago, and
Sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And I've been reflecting a lot, what was left, what is left, in my memory, in the way, but also in the way how I am as a person, and also how I lead. There is anything that I got from my father. Most of the time I don't think it is not necessarily intentional, but something I learned along the way that became something positive for me, right? Because unfortunately we inherited sometimes even the bad habits from other people. But I'm always looking for a positive view. What was for you? What did you learn from your father that is still part of how you lead today?
Two things. My father was almost always in flow. He was always engaged in work. He's retired now. He still is. He will chop wood. He's in his 70s, but he will chop wood for hours because there's intrinsic satisfaction in hard work when you get in a state of flow. That I learned. That's number one. Number two is that he had a tremendous sense of meaning in what he did. Once I asked him, I was fairly young, why did you go into consulting? You would have made a lot more money than just teach your students. You would have been wealthy. And he looked at me slightly offended and responded, wealthy? Imagine all the students that I've helped and all the careers that I've launched. That is wealth to me.
Well said.
He had tremendous meaning in his work as a professor. He did it for 40 years, and he really cared. He was proud of having trained an entire generation in Quebec of financial analysts. That was his wealth.
Wow. What a great end of this episode with this story. And to me, that's legacy. That's legacy in the way you describe it, which is amazing. So let's, you mentioned relationship, our mom, dad, that is a part of the same formula, what we learn from that, the values, the habits, and the things that we learn from that. I think it's always important to remember. Sébastien, thank you so much. It's been such an amazing conversation. So where should people, go if they want to have more conversation with you? Is it LinkedIn? Is your company? What's your preference?
First of all, I would go on Amazon and buy The Psychology of Leadership by Sébastien
Well
Page.
said.
And then you can find me on Substack. I write stories every Sunday these days. So that's a good place. Sébastien Page, you'll find me very easily on Substack.
Oh, that's great. So not very common, people at your level, they use Substack. So that's great. Sébastien, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a fantastic conversation. So really thank you for that.
Thank you.